Hey everyone. One of the questions that I've been getting a lot recently is what happens if someone who never had access to Cherwell needs to have access to the data that is accessible via Cortex? That's a fantastic question, uh, right? One of the things that I've been saying from the very beginning about Cortex is that it uses everything from the Cherwell database, and you need to make no changes to your Cherwell data in order for everything to continue working. So how do we reconcile that with the fact that if you onboard a new person or if someone now has to have access to the Cherwell data, obviously that information has to go somewhere. Well, we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but before we get into it and do a demo of it, of course, I want to remind you all that every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, I host what I call the Cortex Users Group. This is an hour that I have set aside to be available for all of you who are either using Cortex or thinking about using Cortex or just have questions about Cortex and want to ask me or anyone else who is also in one of those three categories. Um, any questions that you have, talk about any experiences you have with Cortex, questions, specific configurations that you have in your Cherwell database that uh, are or are not working as you expect in Cortex, and trying to figure out exactly what they should look like. And also, that's a good opportunity to get kind of a sneak peek into my product roadmap for Cortex. I tend to bounce some ideas that I have about where I can take Cortex off of the group that shows up there. So if you want to be involved in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description below. You can get an invite to that meeting. Again, it's every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. In addition, down in the description below, you'll see lots of links to get in touch with me, schedule time on my calendar, learn more about Cortex, find the documentation, and also there's a link to the demo site that I'll be using uh, in the demo a little bit later in this video. So with that, let's get into it. So the big problem and the reason that I haven't implemented something to solve this problem so far is that the obviously we want to keep the shareable data intact. We want to be able to say that the data that you export from Cherwell on the last day that you're using Cherwell is in fact the data that Cortex is looking at, that is being displayed. Those records, the items in the grid, those bits out forms are showing the data that was in Cherwell as it existed on the last day that you were using Cherwell. So we want to be really, really careful about making any changes to that data. In fact, to date, and it is my plan to continue this, Cortex requires zero changes to your Cherwell database. However, things happen, times change. Um, you may onboard new employees. Employees might leave. You might move employees around. Someone who is involved in HR might move over to finance, or IT might move over to HR. Yeah, who knows, right? You have different people who need access to different things, or you have new people who need new access to things that existed in Cherwell. But obviously, we want to make sure that you don't have to make any changes to the Cherwell database. So what we've done is we've added a new table, essentially. Uh, and more specifically, we've added what is called in SQL Server a schema. Um, this is getting a little into the technical weeds, so if you don't want to hear the technical stuff, you can just gloss over for a bit and come back for the demo. But what we've ended up doing is creating a separate schema that's called Cortex. So all of your Cherwell data can exist in the default schema, which is typically DBO. All of the databases that I've encountered, the schema, or in earlier versions of SQL Server, It was called the database owner. Um, and in fact, in I think the Cherwell connection configuration wizard, it's also called database owner. But that's the default schema. It's basically a collection of database objects, tables. I think stored procedures go in there as well. Um, Most of the time, when people are building out databases, they just use one of these containers um, for generally simple applications. For more complex applications, you might see different schemas segmented off so that different components of the application can be kind of in their own little world. But the important part for this is that uh, different schemas can have different permissions. So, for instance, the user that you connect to SQL Server with Cortex, or that Cortex uses to connect to SQL Server, can have read-only permissions to the default schema, the DBO schema, and then read-write permissions to, and that's an oversimplification, obviously. The SQL permissions are much broader than that. There are a lot of different permissions, but essentially read-write permissions to the Cortex schema. Um, and that means that your Cherwell data can remain pristine as it was the the last day that you used Cherwell, and then everything in the Cortex schema can be managed by Cortex. And uh, who knows? As Cortex evolves, maybe there will be more that ends up in there. But for right now, it's just this authentication information that we're about to see in this little quick demo. Uh, Now, I will say none of what I'm about to show you, uh, or none of the changes that we've made, require that you have a read write user or read write access to any part of the database. Um, Cortex will continue to work perfectly fine if the database is in read only mode. You just won't be able to do additional user management functionality. And that's something that I also plan to continue as Cortex evolves. So if you need to keep your database 100% locked down, totally fine. You just might miss out on some of the nice to have functionality from Cortex. All of the major functionality, all of the required functionality uh, in Cortex will always be available no matter whether you have read-only access, read-write access. Um, that's a commitment that we're going to carry forward. It's just some of these nice to have, some of these quality of life enhancements that we're adding that kind of need somewhere to store their data. That's going to fall into this category of if you allow Cortex to have write access to the Cortex schema, and documentation will be coming soon to the documentation site on all of this. Uh, if you do that, then you can do a little bit more with Cortex. So with that, let me jump into a demo. So I've already logged into Cortex, and this is the demo site. Again, link down below. And you'll notice that there's a new user management tab down at the bottom. I was having trouble trying to figure out what exactly to call this because we're not really adding users to the system. That's handled by the SSO configuration, the authentication configuration. We're not adding security groups to the system because that's handled by the security group definitions that come over from Cherwell. What we're really configuring is the mapping from users, either by username or email address, uh, to security group. And there are kind of three use cases for this. The first one is if you're uh, logging in as a user that existed in Cherwell. So you can see here, I already have a record in this table here. Um, and I didn't actually add this. This was automatically created when I logged in as CSD admin. So first things first, one of the things that we're doing is as soon as you log in, we're actually pulling that information out and saving it in this new table. The reason we're doing that is because we don't want to pull all of the information from the Cherwell database, all of the existing mappings from usernames to security groups, and just have this big long table for, in most cases, 5 to 10% of the total number of users, if that, are actually going to be logging into Cortex. So it makes this table a little bit more manageable if we only pull in that information when it's needed. If there isn't something in this table that indicates mapping from a particular user to their security group, it continues to fall back to the Cherwell table, and we just add it to this table as those come up. That happens totally automatically behind the scenes by Cortex as part of the authentication process. The second use case is what happens if you need to add a user who exists in your SSO that never existed in Cherwell. Well, let's do that. Just do add a user and specify the username. Sure, autocomplete's going to help me out and say bparks. Sure, why not? And depending on how your SSO is set up, the email address may or may not be required. If you're looking up users in Cherwell by email address, the email address is required here. If you're using the username, which I think is how most authentication providers are set up with Cherwell, don't quote me on that. You, depending on your setup, you probably know the answer to this. The username is absolutely required. The email address is probably required. It can't hurt to have both filled in. And then pick a security group. So I'm going to say IT Service Desk Manager. And then we'll just save that row. And now we've added a user to the system. So before I added that user to the system, obviously bparks does not exist in my Cherwell database. If I had logged in as bparks, it would have just mapped me to the anonymous browser security group, which is the security group that users get assigned before they're logged into the portal, which means they basically have access to nothing. They have access to something, but it's very little. So you probably want to assign a security group to all of your new users. Okay, so let's say third use case. Let's say that I'm no longer an IT service desk manager and I need to be assigned to a different security group. I can just hit edit and maybe we'll just assign me to portal customer and save, and boom, next time I log in, I'll only be able to see the business objects and the records that a portal customer can see. And that's it. It's really that simple. Yeah, there really isn't that much more to say about it. So hopefully that made sense. I know there were some technical details in there, but there was also the demo. And maybe there are other use cases that I didn't think of, but I think those three use cases are the most important ones. I guess the only other one maybe that might come up is if you want to delete a user. I didn't really create that sort of flow in this particular feature because that should be handled by your SSO setup anyway. If a user leaves your organization, they should lose access to your single sign-on provider. And depending on which SSO provider you're using, the application or client configuration in your SSO provider, you can usually say, X, Y, and Z users have access to this app via the SSO provider. So you could limit it that way. If, say, you only want, your legal department to have access to Cherwell. I don't know. I'm just making things up as I go. But if it's only specific people, you grant those specific people access to that application via your SSO provider, and then no one else can log into, no one else can use SSO to log into Cortex, and it's kind of managed that way. There is a delete button. If I switch back to the demo, there is a delete button on these individual rows. That doesn't delete the user from the system. That deletes this override. So if you just wanted to go back to, say, CSD admin should just go back to whatever was configured in Cherwell, you can just delete that record. And of course, it'll get repopulated the next time CSD admin uh, is logged in. But that can kind of clean up this table, remove some of those excess overrides if you end up accumulating some of them. That's what that delete button does. I don't anticipate that being a huge use case, but it's there if you need it. Hopefully that was helpful, informative, answered some questions, and um, provides an answer response solution to some of the questions I've gotten over the last couple of weeks about how user management is going to work moving forward in Cortex. Um, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, leave them down below or shoot me an email. And thanks for watching. And I hope to see you in the Cortex users group every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. But if not, make sure you're subscribed, like the video, and I will see you in the next one.